So in this lecture, I want to say a bit more about deductive and inductive arguments. Specifically, I want to say more about this concept of validity. It only applies to deductive arguments, but it's really important. And it's a bit tricky, and we're going to touch on it over and over in this class, so I think it's good to take a first pass at it. So there's two questions we should ask ourselves in evaluating an argument. Are the premises true? And how well would the premises, if they were true, support the conclusion? So validity, again, it only applies to deductive arguments, and it's all about question 2. It's all about whether, if the premises are true, do they make it the case the conclusion can't be false? So when you think about validity, don't think about the content of the argument, but only the structure. Don't think about whether the premises are true. That's not really applicable to validity. Validity is just if they are true, conclusion can't be false. So here's a valid deductive argument. If a baseball team's fans riot, they will lose the game. There's actually a rule in baseball about this, right? It doesn't quite say if your fans riot, you lose the game, but it says if the game can't be played because of conditions at your field, for example, a riot, then you lose, right? So if your fans riot, that makes it impossible to finish. You will lose the game by forfeit in Major League Baseball. So if the fans riot, the team will lose. The White Sox fans will riot, so the White Sox will lose the game, right? The White Sox actually for years and years held the dubious distinction of being the last Major League team to lose a game by forfeit because the fans rioted. They don't anymore. I forget who does. I knew this until I started recording the lecture, and now I've forgotten. Really, really just shameful incident in the White Sox history, disco demolition night. Let's just say, don't blow up things on the field if you don't want your fans to riot. It's usually a bad idea to blow things up. That might encourage the fans to do things they themselves should not do. Valid deductive argument. If it's really true that anytime the fans riot, the team loses the game, and the White Sox fans will riot, then they will lose the game. Invalid deductive argument. If a baseball team's fans riot, they will lose the game. The White Sox lost the game, so the fans must have rioted. See, this is invalid because remember, a valid deductive argument, we can't imagine a way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false, right? Here we can. It could be true that if your fans riot, you lose, and that you lost, but the fans might not have rioted because there's plenty of other ways to lose a baseball game, right? In fact, the usual way of losing a baseball game is just that the opposing team scores more runs than you do, right? That's another way of losing. So even if these premises were true, we can imagine a way the conclusion could be false. Here's another one. If Bob gets an A on the exam, he will pass logic, right? Or pass whatever class you have in mind. We can imagine that this is just mathematically true, right? He comes and asks the professor. Professor says, well, let's look at your grades. Well, if we add any grade of 90 or better in for your final exam, you will get an A. Just mathematically, that's how the numbers add up. Bob got an A on the final exam, so he will pass logic, right? If it's really true that any A grade will get him to pass, and he got an A grade, well, then it has to be true that he will pass, right? Here's an invalid one, right? If he gets an A on the final exam, he will pass logic. He didn't get an A on the final exam, therefore he will not pass logic. Think about this a second, why this is invalid, how the premises could be true and the conclusion false. Well, it could be true and the conclusion false because there could be plenty of other ways to get the points he needs to pass, right? Maybe there's a bunch of extra credit work and he did that, so he has the points even though he didn't get an A on the final exam. All 1 tells you is that getting an A is a way for him to pass logic. It doesn't say that it's the only way, right? Plenty of other ways, or at least there might be, he can get the points he needs. So you know, it's not necessarily true that if he doesn't get an A on the final exam, he won't pass, right? Okay, so a few more important points. So, not all valid arguments are good ones. Validity is only about how the premises would support the conclusion if they were true. This is really, really important to keep in mind. And the premises might not be true. All that validity tells you is if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Validity doesn't tell you the premises actually are true. When you know an argument's valid, it might still be the case that the premises are false. And if they are, even though the argument's valid, it's not a good argument. Validity is only a first step here, right? Argument has to be valid. It also has to have true premises. So here's a valid argument with false premises. No mammal lays eggs. All lizards are mammals, so no lizard lays eggs, right? This is a valid argument. If 1 and 2 were true, 3 would have to be true as well. But they're not true, right? Both 1 and 2 are false. There are mammals that lay eggs. Not many, but you have the platypus, you have the echidna. Plus 2, even more so, it's not true that all lizards are mammals. In fact, none of them are, right? If you remember high school biology. So this is a valid argument, but it's a really bad argument with a false conclusion, and it's a bad argument because even though it's valid, it has false premises. So we'll add one more thing on top of validity. We'll talk about deductive arguments being sound. A sound argument is valid and all of its premises are true. Now, one thing to keep in mind is validity is all or nothing. You know, when we talk about validity in philosophy, in logic classes, we're using the term in a pretty specialized way. You know, I know in ordinary language people will talk about, well, that's a pretty valid point, or that's not really a valid point, or that's somewhat valid. We don't use the term in that way in philosophy, right? We mean something different. You know, when people talk about validity in ordinary language, they might just mean good or bad or strong or weak, right? We use it to mean something very specialized. For us, it means if premises, true conclusion cannot possibly be false. The way we use it is all or nothing. So just keep that in mind. You know, if you talk about arguments being a little bit valid or a lot valid or somewhat valid in logic, you will annoy your professor. So don't do that, okay? Just keep that in mind. We use the term in a specialized way. Make sure you're using that way in this class. Going back to inductive arguments cannot be valid. Strictly speaking, every single inductive argument ever is an invalid argument. But that doesn't mean they're bad arguments. Validity is just really a poor way to measure an inductive argument, so don't really apply the concept when you're dealing with inductive arguments. Inductive arguments can be stronger or weaker. They can't be valid. The strength of an inductive argument is a matter of degree. It's not all or nothing, and remember, validity is all or nothing. So anyway, just to finish up with deductive and inductive arguments for now, We will say a lot about the inductive-deductive distinction going forward. It will be really important to this class. Even next week, when we talk about filling in premises, Lavin doesn't talk too much about it in this regard, but the inductive-deductive distinction is important even when we're going to fill in premises, because we'll have to decide what kind of argument we are dealing with to figure out what kinds of premises we'll have to fill in. So even next week, this will start to be important. Now, one sort of complicating factor, and I don't want to make a big deal of this, but it's worth keeping in mind, is that in the real world, arguments will draw on both deductive arguments and inductive arguments. If you are reading a long article in a magazine or a newspaper or a book or a philosophy journal or whatever, you might see someone use a string of inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, right? One common way people might do this, you might make an inductive argument to establish a premise in a larger deductive argument, right? Let me give you guys an example. Let's say I want to argue that war is always immoral. And I have a principle, any action that results in the death of innocent people or even has too high a risk of resulting in the deaths of innocent people is immoral, is wrong, right? Well, I might make a long inductive argument to show that wars have a super high risk of killing innocent people, that they pretty much always do that. Then I might add that to my principle, that it's wrong to do something that has this risk, and get a deductive argument that war is wrong, right? The inductive argument might prove one principle in this larger deductive argument. That is not uncommon. Less common is the other way around, but just keep in mind, in the real world, in a written article or whatever, you might see both kinds of reasoning hook up together. We won't do much of that in this course, because I want to focus on one kind or the other, just to make things simple for you guys, but just keep this in mind, what you might see in the real world in arguments you find, in the wild, so to speak.